You know that VisualPolitik is one of the few political channels that pays a lot of attention to Latin America, one of the least covered regions in the world. Perhaps that is why many of you have often asked us to talk more about Latin America, despite the way I butcher Spanish names. Well, we have a solution. We're proud to present LatamPolitik, a newsletter that we have prepared together with geopolitical consulting firm Perch Perspectives. If you subscribe, every month you will receive 12 newsletters with the best information and analysis on Latin America to keep you up to date and better understand everything that is happening in the region. The cost? You can subscribe for less than 35 cents per newsletter, less than a small taco or donut a week. In return, you'll be kept up to date on all the major happenings in the region and better understand all the possible implications. In addition, all of you who support us at Patreon level 4 and 5 will receive LatamPolitik at zero cost. You can find all the info at latampolitik.com. On the 14th of February 2021, Carlos Saúl Menem, who was President of Argentina for 2 terms, passed away at the age of 90. We are talking about one of the most controversial figures in Argentine politics. There is no middle ground. Depending on who you talk to, they either idolize him or demonize him.
Estoy muy triste porque fue el mejor presidente que tuvimos y el mejor gobernador.
Fue una época muy mala para todo el país. Económicamente nos vinimos muy abajo.
Menem was a politician to the core, one of those social leaders who liked to be surrounded by famous people such as sportsmen, artists and models, and also who had no qualms about saying one thing and then doing the complete opposite.
It is not known how much time will pass, how much blood will be shed, but our territory, Malvinas, will return to the people. Carlos Saúl Menem, February 14th, 1989, 1 year before resuming relations with the United Kingdom.
Basically a perfect politician. This was a strategy that somehow served him both for winning elections and for making enemies. For 10 years, between 1989 and 1999, he was President of Argentina. And friends, I can assure you this was a really intense period. His liberal reforms and multiple accusations of corruption gave shape to a period that some have called the time when Argentina wanted to change. But who exactly was Carlos Saúl Menem, and how did he change Argentina? Why did the reforms he promoted not hold up over time? Did he really have a plan to stop the doomed trend towards collapse that Argentina has been following for more than 70 years? If you're interested, listen up.
Look of a leader.
Carlos Menem was born in Anilaco, a small town in the Argentine province of La Rioja, on the 2nd of July 1930. He was the son of Syrian immigrants when Syria still belonged to the Turkish Empire. Throughout his life, he was in fact known as the Turkish Menem. From a very young age, he had a clear inclination for politics, being a militant in the Peronist movement, a movement that became forbidden after the fall of Juan Domingo Perón in 1955. Almost 20 years later, when democracy returned in 1973, along with the return of Perón to the presidency, Menem was elected governor of the La Rioja region, a position he held until the 24th of March 1976, when a new military coup took place. From that moment on, our protagonist Menem, as had happened to so many others, had to go from prison to prison. A thorny issue, as we shall see, because one of the most controversial and criticised measures he took when he was president was precisely that of pardoning the military chiefs of the dictatorship. What many do not know is that he himself was a victim of that dictatorship. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. After the return of democracy in 1983, Menem was again elected governor of La Rioja, a position he held until 1989, when he resigned to occupy the presidential seat. At that time, in the 1980s, Menem was seen as a strange character. When the term populism was not yet in vogue, Menem was already a populist. He claimed to be a staunch nationalist. He demanded the recovery of the Malvinas and defended the fight against imperialism. His image was even compared to that of a Riojan caudillo of 1829, Facundo Corriga. Of course, as he made his way into the upper echelons of national power, those exaggerated sideburns gradually diminished until they disappeared completely, which I can relate to. Friends, believe me when I tell you that Carlos Saúl Menem's turnaround as president still causes perplexity. Check this out.
From the Menemobile.
In 1988, the period of President Raúl Alfonsín came to an end. After a complicated and convulsive mandate characterized by the threat of military uprisings, the confrontation with the Peronist trade unions, a bad economic situation even resulting in hyperinflation during his final years, everything seemed to indicate that the successive president would be from the main opposition party, the Peronist party. So, the great electoral dispute took place precisely within this party to win the candidacy. Initially, the great favourite was Antonio Cafiero, a guy who just a year before, in 1987, had won the governorship of the province of Buenos Aires, the richest and most populated province in the country. However, my friends, on this occasion, for the first and only time in the history of the Peronist party, internal elections, equivalent to primaries, were held to choose the party's candidate for the 1989 presidential elections. And as you can see, my friends, there was a surprise. Against all the odds, Menem defeated his opponent by more than 100,000 votes. A new era was born, the era of the Menemistas. From that moment on, our protagonist began to tour every corner of the country aboard the Menemobile, a bus from which Menem kept repeating over and over again his emblematic campaign slogan, "Follow me, I will not let you down." During the campaign, he promised all sorts of things, launching a productive revolution, general wage increases, and even recovering the Falkland Islands with blood and fire. Who could resist this new wave of hope? Although there were many who predicted that with such a populist at the helm, Argentina would end up looking more like Cuba than any other country, it was clear that, at the time, no one could have imagined the great turnaround that this politician was going to bring about. But this is how he rose to the presidency. Pay attention to this last candidate, Álvaro Alzogaray, from the Union of the Democratic Centre. When Menem staged his coup d'etat, he became one of his main advisors.
Entonces, cuando uno lo ve a socialistas como Mitterrand o Felipe González,
sí, señor,
marchar prácticamente en sentido contrario de lo que dice doctrinaria, ideológicamente el socialismo, llega a la conclusión de que nosotros estamos en el camino correcto.
Sharp turn of the steering wheel.
You see, my friends, in 1989, Menem's arrival at the Casa Rosada was not exactly a bed of roses. The economic situation at that time was chaotic, which, well, in the case of Argentina, I don't really think is a surprise to anyone. We are, after all, talking about the country of the eternal crisis. It has been in crisis practically since the late 1940s. The fact is that this president's first month in office were not very different from those of his predecessor. 1989 ended with an inflation rate of over 3,000%, and in 1990 it exceeded 2,300%. Menem's first 20 months in power were as erratic as those of his predecessor. However, hold on one moment, because everything changed in 1991 when Menem revolutionized his cabinet by appointing the then foreign minister, Domingo Felipe Cavallo, as Minister of Economy. From that moment on, Law 23696 on the reform of the state, which had been approved as soon as he came to power back in August 1989, but which had nevertheless been on hold, began to be applied. Suddenly, the country's economic policy, and above all, what had historically been Peronism, took a 180-degree turn.
Que nadie se llame a engaño. La transformación del Estado, la privatización de empresas públicas, la eliminación de regulaciones, el saneamiento de sus cuentas fiscales, la apertura al mundo y la ausencia de controles innecesarios no constituyen un mecanismo para ponerle una bandera de remate a nuestro Estado Nacional, todo lo contrario.
The crisis, hyperinflation, and the international context that was being experienced with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall seemed to make it clear that Argentina had no choice but to change course. And that is exactly what today's protagonist, Carlos Saúl Menem, did. He brought to the table a completely new concept in Argentine politics, the popular market economy. Now, what exactly did this turnaround consist of? Well, basically, it turned the country upside down, meaning a lot of rolling up of sleeves, getting down to work on changing everything. Or, as we will see, almost everything. But let's start at the beginning. On the 27th of March 1991, the convertibility law 23928 was passed, which creates a new currency to replace the Austral, the peso. 4 zeros were eliminated so that 10,000 Australes became 1 peso, which in turn was convertible into $1. In other words, a fixed parity was established to gain the confidence of savers and avoid the temptation to hit the banknote printing machine. As a result, prices began to stabilize and inflation returned to a normal level. Then, in October of that same year, 1991, the deregulatory decree 2 3284 was approved, which liberalised domestic and foreign trade, promoted a tax reform, a capital market reform, and the transformation of the pension system, which became private. And that's not all. At the same time that economic deregulation was promoted, the government launched a huge privatisation plan. During Menem's first term alone, the Argentine government privatized public enterprises in telecommunications, gas, water, electricity, railroads, the post office, television, radio, airlines, and even arms production. Paradoxically, all the companies that Perón had nationalized between 1946 and 1949 were privatized by Menem between 1992 and 1995, thanks to the majority support of Peronist deputies and senators. That huge wave of privatization, together with all the changes approved, made foreign capital flood into the country. According to data from INDEC, Argentina's National Statistic and Census Institute, foreign direct investment rose from about 16 billion in 1992 to more than 65 billion in 1999. To give you an idea of how big this is, the Argentine economy grew between 1991 and 1994 at a rate of 7%. Suddenly, prosperity had reached a destination that seemed impossible, and with it came modernity. Take, for example, what happened in the telecommunications industry. Until that time, it could take decades for the public telephone company, Entel, to install a new line in a home. In fact, houses that had a telephone cost between 10 and 20% more than houses that did not, because it was so difficult to get one. That's crazy, especially when you consider we're talking about the 1980s and the 1990s, and not 1910. Well, the privatization of this industry and the arrival of foreign companies such as Telefonica and Telecom Italia fueled an enormous explosion in the sector. Installing a new line became a matter of a few days, while mobile communication and the fledgling internet also arrived. Exactly the same thing happened with electricity. Up to that time, blackouts were frequent and even programmed by the government itself. However, with privatization, blackouts were reduced considerably, while consumer tariffs dropped by more than 24%. As you can imagine, all these changes and the economic growth that was taking place improved the standard of living of Argentinians, and, in fact, the poverty rate dropped from 47.3% in 1989 to less than half, 22.2% in 1995. But the changes were not linked exclusively to the economy. During Menem's first term in office, with the aim of consolidating democracy, he also promoted policies such as national reconciliation, by which he pardoned all of the military and members of guerrilla groups who had participated in the dictatorship or the succession of attacks in the country experienced in the 1970s and the 1980s. And so, my friends, this is how we arrive at the second term of this politician, with an Argentina that seemed to be about to storm the world again.
The Pact of Olivos.
The first results of the reform plan meant that the 1993 parliamentary elections, which were to renew 1/3 of the Senate and half of the Chamber of Deputies, Peronist candidates swept the board. The support Menem received was so great that for the first and only time in history, Peronism won the city of Buenos Aires itself. However, wait a moment, because there was a problem. At that time, the Argentine constitution set a presidential term of 6 years and forbade immediate re-election. In other words, despite the triumphant atmosphere and popular fervour, Menem could not run in the next elections. And changing the constitution was not an easy task. It required the support of 2/3 of each house of Congress, and at that time, the opposition, led by the Radical Civic Union and its leader, former President Raúl Alfonsín, was not in favour of it. So my friends, what do you think the Argentine president did then? Well, nothing more and nothing less than carry out a surprising political move. You see, as he knew the majority of the electorate was in favour of constitutional reform, he announced a consultation, a non-binding public vote to tell the opposition, come on, I dare you to oppose the will of the people. What a Queen's Gambit. Check and mate. In 1994, Carlos Menem and Raúl Alfonsín signed the Pact of Olivos, which enabled the constitutional reform that would allow him to run for re-election while overhauling the election system. Each presidential term was reduced from 6 to 4 years, and the electoral college was eliminated to establish a direct election in the second round. And that is how, in 1995, Menem was re-elected by a huge majority. He simply swept the elections. However, this new term was not to prove as successful as the first. Check this out.
Debt, stagnation, and poverty.
Everything seemed to be going smoothly. There was monetary stability, inflation was close to 0%, and the growing commercial freedom had opened up Argentines all the products of the great storehouse that is the global market. Argentina seemed to be back on the front line of international success, and the president, surrounded by actresses, artists, and athletes, looked like a rock star. But, wait a minute my friends, don't pop the champagne bottle yet. Despite all the changes, there was one thing that was never corrected: public spending and the enormous size of the Argentine state, which had never stopped growing. For a few years, privatization revenues paid a good chunk of the bills, but then the Argentine government increased its foreign debt more and more. To give you an idea, when Menem came to power, Argentina had a debt of $63 billion. When he left, and in spite of all the income received from privatizations and economic growth, the public debt already amounted to $123 billion. The international markets had trusted Argentina, but once again, the country had overextended itself. In addition, the fixed exchange rate with the dollar kept the peso overvalued, which in the short term was for Argentine companies, which still had to face many rigid labour regulations, an additional effort that complicated their international competitiveness, forcing a productive restructuring that greatly affected industry. The system had a serious sustainability problem. On the one hand, the state could not stop spending without being able to resort to the central bank. On the other hand, maintaining a one-to-one convertibility with the dollar was achieved by supporting the peso, which consumed dollars that had to be financed with more issuing of foreign debt. And, to make matters worse, the one-to-one exchange rate was causing readjustments in the very economic sectors that had to provide the dollars, which meant fewer dollars and more unemployment, followed by even more public spending. And so, back to square one. The result, a huge house of cards. And the reason? 1. The government did not want to tighten its belt. And 2. It did not dare touch convertibility for fear of huge capital flight. And 3. It never wanted to get involved in labour regulation. And sure, maybe the Argentine economy would have worked without addressing 1 or 2 of these issues, but not with avoiding all of them. Unemployment rose, debt skyrocketed, poverty rebounded, and Argentina's finances began to collapse. As if that were not enough, Menem's governments were also marred with many shadows of corruption. Privatization had been carried out, but the subsequent deregularization of the different sectors was not fully executed, perhaps because the incentives pointed in another direction. There were many suspicions of corruption. Yomagate, arms smuggling, bonuses in hidden envelopes, it was non-stop. As long as things were going well, society looked the other way. But when things began to go wrong, then Menem's popularity began to suffer. When he approached the end of his second and therefore final term and wanted to maneuver again to run, this time he did not succeed. In fact, in the 1999 elections, it was the opposition who won the battle. But the situation became so problematic again that in 2001, there was a run on the peso that led to the collapse of 2001 and the infamous Corralito. Suddenly, in a country where almost everyone had been a Menem supporter, it seemed as if no one had ever supported him. This was the case, for example, of the Kirchner couple. In spite of everything, Menem tried running again in 2003 and was the most voted candidate in the first round. However, with no chance of winning the second round against Nestor Kirchner, who had much more support, he decided to throw in the towel.
Let Kirchner keep his 22%, I'll keep my people. I won the first round, and I'm leaving. Carlos Saúl Menem.
You see, my friends, Menem has to be one of the most charismatic politicians in history. In spite of coming to power in a very difficult situation, including hyperinflation, his first term in office was almost a textbook success story, and for the first time in decades, he reawakened the Argentine dream. However, complacency and a failure to complete his homework caused that dream to eventually erupt in a violent explosion that ultimately doomed all of his reforms. Since then, the former president has spent a large part of his life in court, and if he did not actually go to jail, it was only because of his immunity as a senator, a position he held until his last day. But now, having reached this point, it's over to you. How do you assess Carlos Saúl Menem's presidency? Where did you think he failed? Did he follow a clear and predetermined plan, or were the reforms simply a way of buying time? Does Argentina perhaps need a new Menem, like the one in the early 1990s? Leave your comments below, and if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it and subscribe to VisualPolitik. And as always, see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.